we chose Improbable. Let's see. How does this work? I'm bad with technology.
Press the space bar to that button.
There we go. Okay.
Brilliant. So Improbable is a devising company. They do plays, they create new plays through devising, or they do old classics like Shakespeare's, or just literally any script, or they do operas, or they do improvised shows, or they do really avant-garde pieces. Pretty much anything you can think of as theater, they probably do it. And what the core of their philosophy about is all improvisation, which sounds sort of basic in a series of devising companies, but really truly, it's all about improvisation. And they won't set things. They'll keep things not being set, even all the way up until the show goes on, which really freaks out producers, as you can imagine. But they're like, it was on our website. You knew what you were getting into when you started.
You shouldn't be surprised.
They're like, oh, you mean you actually don't set things? So they're like, yes, that we actually don't do that. Yeah. That's great.
Okay. These are a few things that they'll draw from. They'll incorporate a bunch of different art forms, singing, dancing, puppetry. Love the puppetry. And they draw inspiration from a bunch of different sources along with improvisation. A big thing that they do is open space technology, which basically is you have some, like the facilitator will get up and they'll kind of say there'll be some theme or question or big idea, and they'll introduce that, and then everyone will break up into little breakout groups, and they'll discuss this concept that they've been given and kind of come up with their thoughts and ideas about it. And then after that, they'll kind of weave in between groups and kind of see what everyone was thinking, shop around for different ideas. And they'll go back to their groups and they'll write everything down, and then they'll disperse everyone has, all the different groups' thoughts to everyone so everyone can read it. And they'll incorporate that along with the improvisation.
And so a lot of their rehearsal process, a lot of their devising is all about building the ensemble and building the relationships between the performers and getting them to trust each other and trust the work and come to understand this together. And once that they feel like they've gotten to a good point with that, once they feel like they've achieved that, then sort of like Alex was saying that first day of class, they'll sort of converge it ever so slightly and set the things that they need to set, like fight choreography or set movements. And so there will be things that do have to be set just for safety reasons. Like they did the play My Neighbor Totoro recently, where they've got this enormous Totoro puppet with 6 people in it. And they have to set that because if they didn't set it, it could fall over and everyone would get squished. But that's really something that's very interesting to them, is that interplay of the set bits with then the bits that are more free, and they flow into each other, and maybe the set bits affect the improvised bits in a different way each night. Yeah, go ahead. Another thing that I mentioned earlier that they focus on is they're really interested, they say stories come from the space between the actors. That's one thing they work a lot in their devising.
What do they mean by that?
Well, if you have multiple actors on stage, in perhaps a more American method approach, they're really focused on the character backstories, and they're all, coming in their own heads and trying to do everything in the character, and it almost becomes sort of an isolated performance to their mind. Whereas when their focus is literally on the space, then everything becomes about that space and about that interaction, which is their goal.
Okay, thank you.
And telling the story is using the space in between people as well as the people.
Mm-hmm.
Space can say a lot of things. Okay. We've kind of broken up their process into the role of the director, the rehearsal process, and the performance. I'm kind of going to look at each of the things that they do with those. So the director, they kind of, one of the big things, actually, first I'm going to read this quote. So they have a bunch of podcasts that they've done about shows and stuff. And so one of the things they said in the podcast was, it will sort itself out and will get more details than if I sort it out now. And that's kind of one of their concepts when it comes to like the director of it, that they just kind of step back and do the least they can. A big thing it talked about them doing is just like encouraging people, the actors, to trust the process. Because, I mean, not setting a lot of things can get very nerve-wracking, and so that was a big thing that I was talking about the director doing, is just being something to say, there, it'll be okay. And then also, another thing that the director does is they have to decide, like, okay, which things do we need to set, and which things can we leave as just to be improvised for the performance. And then also just, like, helping, when you're doing so much improvisation, sometimes people can kind of get doing different things. So kind of just making sure that everyone is doing like, that it falls within the same show. Great, okay.
And so for the rehearsal process, one thing that they do every rehearsal at the beginning and end is they have a check-in where they essentially just say whatever is alive inside of them was the phrase that they used. And so
That's cute.
that can come to incorporate personal experiences into the work. They can have open discussions about what it's like to be working on the play or what it's like just to be living their lives. And then once they do that, then they get into the rehearsal. And then the same thing when they're leaving at the end of the day, which is really interesting. And another thing...
So they repeat that process at the end of the rehearsal, what's alive in me?
Yeah.
That's really beautiful, and I actually love that phrase as well.
Yeah, and sometimes it doesn't. You don't necessarily have to say anything in this process either. You can just say nothing for your check-in, and that's completely acceptable. And one thing I found really interesting about the rehearsal process, they were describing what they would do when they were working on established scripts. It's different when they're doing an improvised show, which they often
Pause you
do.
for 1 second and say, hello Laura, come be with us. We're so delighted to have you with us. And Daniel, I'll hand back over to you. Yes.
But when they have an established script, what they'll do is they'll record their lines on a microphone and then play them over a speaker while the actors act in the space that very first week of rehearsal, so that they find their characters really quickly without going through the traditional process of having your book in hand and trying to get off book, and then once you're off book, finally we can act. What they do is they do that first week and they just completely full send it with the lines being played over a speaker. And what often happens is that they find the characters really, really quickly in that first week because they're so free and they can just move. And they're like, well, great, this is amazing. And then once they have the books back, they sort of lose that. And so the rehearsal process is about trying to find what they had in that first week again, which they always are able to do, because now they know it's there, so they can trust that they can find their way back to it. Open space technology, Alyssa mentioned, that was devised, I mean, that was brought up by business type people as just a general problem solving strategy. I think this is the only company that really applies it to theater building, and what it means is that anytime an actor wants to, they can just put a question up on the wall or a statement, and those questions will either be addressed in a specific rehearsal or they'll just live as questions for everyone to be seeing on the wall while they're going through the rehearsal process.
Okay. And then the last thing is the performance. Those things that were there, they'll come back, and when they come back is when they're in front of an audience. So, which can be a little nerve-wracking. Again, with the role of the director being to say, there, it'll be okay. So basically, they keep a lot of things unset for the performance, and their big thing is that just everyone has to be aware of the other actors and respond to the improvisations that are going on, and trust what they did earlier in that improvisation ensemble and all that they were able to get. And they say that the thing that's going to hurt the performance is when people think like, oh, what can I do that'll be funny, or like get in their heads and think what can they do, rather than thinking of what everyone else is doing and how to respond to that. And then just remembering the balance that they set earlier in rehearsal, that the director said, okay, these things are set, these things you can improvise, and making sure to go along with those. Great. Okay. And then these are our sources. We found a lot of podcasts.
Did you create this on My Neighbour Totoro, the RSC? Did they collaborate with the RSC?
They were the company that did that.
Oh, I heard that was one of the best shows in the UK this past year or two. Did anyone see it on Study Abroad? Wade was singing its praises and saying it was one of the very best shows he'd seen. I didn't realise this was them.
Yeah, the RSC commissioned them
Mm-hmm.
because of their unique, especially with the puppetry experience that they had.
Mm-hmm.
Which I have to say is interesting. If you've ever worked with Chris Peterson on Shakespeare, she does a process called underreading. Which, have you done that before? Which is very much like this, where you have a shadow actor who's reading your lines for you so that you just embody the character and don't worry about the lines at all. So it sounds very similar to that process.
Great.
Sorry.
All right. Anyways, if you want to look at some podcasts, I would especially recommend the Totoro one. It was really good. So,
Very cool.
No.
awesome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much,